My father, Clifford, was born in Albany, Oregon on May 16th, 1924, and died last week at his home in Crow, just a mile up the road from this church, and only 50 miles away from Albany, where he was born. But between his birth and his death, 97 years later, there are some remarkable things to tell. With his wife, Frances, with us today, Cliff spent 46 years as a missionary in a remote part of Japan, telling the gospel and establishing churches. Today, 11 churches in that area stand as testimony to the work of Clifford and Frances Leonard. And now for the story of how Clifford came to dedicate his life to telling the old story of Jesus and his love that is very far away and very different from Oregon. Clifford was the first child of Charles and Cora Leonard. His mother had been a school teacher before her marriage, and his father was a surveyor who later went into the road construction business. Following Clifford, his parents had two more, here's little Clifford. Following Clifford, his parents had two more children, Violet and Lois. The family attended the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in Albany. In their home, they often hosted missionaries who were visiting the church, some from Central and South America, others from China, which in those days before the Communist Revolution of 1949 was still open to missionaries. Church and the Bible were central parts of the Leonard family's life, and one of Clifford's happy early memories was of him and his sisters, after their family Bible reading, walking up the stairs to bed, singing a hymn. I guess I should be more clear without this. When Clifford was 12 years old, the family moved to Portland. And in July of 1939, when Clifford was 15 years old, tragedy struck the family. While his mother was driving Clifford and his younger sister Lois to a church camp at Canby Campground, their car was hit by a freight train at a railroad crossing. Clifford and his mother were severely injured, and his 9-year-old sister Lois was killed. She was 3 days short of her 9th birthday, actually. Clifford recovered well enough to be active on his high school track team and was even elected class president. After graduating from high school in 1942, here he is, he enrolled in Wheaton College, a small Christian liberal arts college near Chicago. World War II had already been convulsing the world. The United States had been at war since December of the preceding year, and Clifford was now 18 years old and about to be drafted. After completing his first semester at Wheaton, he enlisted in the U.S. military, was assigned to the Army Air Force, which would later be named the U.S. Air Force, and sent to the University of Chicago to be trained as a meteorologist, a weather forecaster. After a year of studies in meteorology, some experience at the Victorville Army Airfield in Southern California, and then a brief visit home with his parents and his surviving sister, Violet, Clifford was shipped out to New Guinea to help provide the weather forecasts that were vital to the ships and airplanes of the U.S. military as they fought their way from one island to the next, steadily advancing toward the homeland of their adversary, Japan. Clifford had just been moved to Manila in the Philippines in preparation for the invasion that everyone knew was coming and everyone knew would involve enormous cost in blood and lives on all sides. But in 1945, August, as soon as news came in that the atomic bombs had brought Japan to surrender, Cliff was part of the first United States units that landed to set up an airfield for the incoming U.S. flights that would follow. Clifford remembered that on his first night in Japan, his unit had been assigned a building right next to a barracks that was still occupied by Japanese soldiers who had not yet been sent home. Cliff and his buddies did not sleep that night. They were afraid that the resentful Japanese soldiers in the next building might murder their group while they slept. As it turned out, they were gone in the morning. Clifford remained posted in Japan for the next 5 months, helping to operate the U.S. airfields, and had ample opportunity to see the devastated country up close. Years of war and aerial bombing had left the country's economy and infrastructure in ruins. And the unthinkable, unbearable reality of Japan's unconditional surrender had devastated the nation's psyche. The Japanese emperor, until then regarded as a Shinto god, had been demoted to the status of a mortal man. The Japanese gods had failed the nation of Japan, leaving it materially ruined and spiritually empty. When Clifford was discharged and returned home in February of 1946, he was glad to leave Japan behind and did not anticipate ever wanting to return. Rejoining his parents and sister in Oregon, he began taking accounting classes that would be useful when he joined his father's contracting business. But only a month after Clifford arrived safely home from the war that had killed and injured so many other people, tragedy struck the family again. Clifford's father, Charles, was killed instantly when his car was hit by a train at a railroad crossing near Rooster Rock along the Columbia River, in an accident very similar to the one that had killed Cliff's younger sister 7 years earlier. Now the family was only 3. When his father was killed, Clifford was just a few months before reaching his 22nd birthday. But he had already seen and experienced more suffering and loss than many people do in a lifetime. Now he had to decide how to proceed with his life. Should he carry on with his father's contracting business? What should he do? I have often heard my father recount that several months after the accident that killed his father, Cliff happened to notice another car his father had owned that had been left out in the rain. It was beginning to rust, and weeds were growing under it. For Cliff, this rusting car portrayed the impermanence of earthly things, something he had also experienced at first hand in the ruined country of Japan. The shortness and uncertainty of human life had also been brought home to Cliff at close hand by the sudden deaths of 2 family members. Turning over these things in his mind, Clifford resolved that from then onward, he would focus only on what would count for eternity. This was summarized in a phrase that Clifford often quoted: "Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." In the fall of 1946, Clifford resumed his studies at Wheaton College, but now he had a clear goal. He was going to preach the gospel to the spiritually needy people of Japan. Just a few months before graduating in the class of 49, he met a fellow Wheaton student named Frances Felton, who had a similar desire to make her life count for Christ. By the end of the summer, they were engaged and were married on August 26, 1950. Frances was one of 5 Felton sisters, 3 of whom were engaged to be married about the same time. And to save money, the 3 weddings were combined into a single event, a triple wedding. While Clifford continued his studies at Faith Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, Frances took a year-long course in nursing, which of course is useful for a missionary family going out of this what they thought was the civilized world. Clifford received his Master of Sacred Theology degree in 1953 from Faith Theological Seminary. Then came a year of missionary training with the New Tribes Mission, and ordination as a minister of the gospel. Their preparations were now complete, and in the fall of 1954, they embarked on a ship to Japan. Japanese is a very difficult language to learn for someone who did not grow up speaking it. Clifford and Francis spent their first year and a half in Japan attending a language school in the Tokyo area. They would take classes in the morning at the famous Naganuma Language Institute and spend time in the afternoons, in the morning with the Naganuma, and in the afternoons they had a paid tutor come in who worked with them personally in their rented house. At night they would review their lessons. Notice what keeps the room warm here, or fails to keep the room warm, is a little pot of charcoal burning that you see beside Francis in the corner. Even before they were able to hold a conversation in Japanese or understand what was being said to them in Japanese, they would memorize a short gospel message in Japanese written out for them and transliterated into the Romanized characters that English uses. In Japanese it's called romaji. When they went for a walk in the countryside and met someone, perhaps a farmer working in a rice field, they would deliver their memorized gospel message in Japanese without necessarily understanding individual words of their memorized speech. And they tell me that at least once they forgot where they were in the memorized speech and had to start from the beginning. Once Clifford and Francis had gained some fluency in the Japanese language, it was time for them to decide where they would base their evangelistic work. Clifford inquired, what area of Japan had the fewest Christians? He was directed to the Noto Peninsula, an out-of-the-way area on the less populated side of Japan that faces toward Korea and the Sea of Japan. In the spring of 1956, Noto is the tip of the peninsula. The prefecture of Ishikawa actually extends back into the mainland a bit. So there's Wajima. In the spring of 1956, Clifford and Francis moved to the town of Wajima, a town near the end of the Noto Peninsula, with a population of about 20,000. The principal industries of the town were fishing and lacquerware craft. Clifford and Francis rented a house, put up a sign, and began telling the gospel to those people who had never heard of God's message of salvation. The sign says in the upper right-hand corner, Bible Church, which might be a bit ambitious because I don't think they had a single believer attending at this point, but it's the thought that counts. Bible Church. And you see also in the middle, there is one of those big scripture passage illustrations with the explanation or a caption below in Japanese. And I think that same role is for you may have seen it as you came in this sort of little exhibit we have set up here. They would hold evangelistic meetings in their rented house and on the street. The sign above says autumn evangelistic meetings from November 20th to 23rd. The rented house was across the road from the local high school, which was important because they had the opportunity to approach young people who might be more open to a new message like this. They held meetings in their house, on the street. They went from house to house to individually. They would hold tent meetings in an empty lot. In season and out of season, all things to all people, they would bring the good news to the people of this rural area. Let's see, and here are some of the groups that attended. For transportation, a foreigner playing an accordion was often enough of a novelty in itself to draw a crowd. And you probably saw the accordion also on a table out there in our little exhibits. For transportation, Cliff would ride his motorcycle, and Francis would sometimes ride beside him in a sidecar. The roads in the Noto Peninsula were nearly all gravel at this time, so this was not a very comfortable way to travel. home meetings are a more a more approachable way for many Japanese people to hear the gospel, because they don't have to come to a building that's labeled church. And so home meetings were a common strategy, you might say. And here is Francis with holding a meeting in someone's home. And slowly, very slowly, and a few people at a time, interest arose. People showed interest, accepted Christ. Here's another home meeting. Here's a street side meeting. The big letters up at the top say the salvation of Christ, and it looks like Francis is distributing Bibles or selling Bibles. Here's a close-up. And here's another believer who is apparently brave enough to go with Cliff to a meeting in some outlying area. And it looks like it's raining, or rain is expected, but they do not let that stop them from their appointed rounds. And here is another believer giving a message using what's called a flannel graph. It's a flat board held up on an easel with characters made of flannel that will stay where they are and not slip down. And long before the days of video playback devices or this is what missionaries used to portray Bible stories that they were telling. Here's another group. The uniforms are the high school uniforms worn by high school boys. The man at the far right later became the pastor of the second largest church there in Nanao. That's a later story. Here's Cliff playing his accordion. That is, again, the same accordion that you saw out there. It says, Jesus saves, in mother of pearl. And this is the tent they would use. This might be from a later period of history, because I think I see Joy at the very, very back. Is that you? Okay. So this is from a somewhat later period. We're jumping ahead, but the tent stayed the same. It got older and older and older. And the benches, very rough wooden benches. He would get permission to use an empty lot and set up the tent and have the meeting. And since not everyone had color television in those days, you may as well come and see what the foreigner is saying and playing the accordion. So we had a good audience. And here's one of the believers. The picture is black and white, but I imagine she is presenting the lesson. She's holding cutouts of hearts of different kinds. So the heart black with sin, washed in the red blood of Christ, and turns white as snow. I think that is the story that she's telling here. Okay, another home meeting. Let's see, where am I here? Oops. Okay, so as the number of believers increased, they no longer had appropriate amount of space in their little rented house. So Clifford bought. So in these days, the U.S. military occupation that had begun in 1945 was winding down, and the structures that were no longer needed by the American military were being offered to those who would take them down and carry them away. Clifford obtained 2 disassembled U.S. Army barracks made of corrugated sheet metal in the half-cylindrical style that is called a Quonset Hut. He got the pieces loaded onto a railroad flat car and arranged them to be taken up to Wajima. With the help of the local believers and some other missionaries, he reassembled the pieces into a longer Quonset Hut and then added, let's see. Okay, we're going to added a 2-story box at one end to provide additional space, and the roof on which he could add a steeple and a cross. There is a type of Japanese fish paste loaf, one might say, called kamaboko, that is traditionally shaped and cooked in the form of a half-cylinder. And so for many years afterwards, the believers would informally speak of the Wajima Church as the Kamaboko Barracks Church. And there it is. That is where I grew up. Inviting one's neighbor to attend a Christian meeting sounds like a relatively safe thing to do, but in Japan it's not so easy. Although the post-war constitution written under the supervision of the American occupation does indeed guarantee freedom of religion, societal and family pressures against foreign religions are enormously powerful. In the United States, there's a classic gospel song called "Give Me That Old-Time Religion," including the line, "It was good for my father, it was good for my mother, and it's good enough for me." This is not a sentiment to which a missionary to Japan can appeal. For them, for a Japanese person, especially in a rural area, the old-time religion is a uniquely distinctive Japanese combination of Buddhist and Shinto beliefs, an inconsistent yet deeply rooted web of belief that has been the foundation of Japanese culture for many centuries. Family ties and ancestral ties are extremely important in Japan. When a person dies, they are typically cremated, and their ashes are placed in the family grave, which is usually a vertical stone, as we see here, inscribed with a phrase representing their particular sect of Buddhism. And I don't have a picture of it, but in every traditional home there is a Buddhist altar, a Bhutsudan, containing memorial tablets for each deceased member of the family. And a living family member is responsible for offering prayers and incense at that altar each day to the ancestors. Since a convert to Christianity cannot continue this practice, nor agree to have their ashes placed in the Buddhist grave of their family, becoming a Christian can mean that the new believer has broken those family ties. Not only family ties, but social ties with the neighborhood are also deeply involved with Japanese Buddhist and Shinto religious festivals and observances. So for a Japanese person in a rural area, becoming a Christian is like becoming a foreigner, like turning into an alien. For the believers of the Wajima Church, especially those who were advanced in age and could see what was coming, it was crucially important that they have a Christian grave in which their ashes could be placed when they died. Here is the Wajima Church grave in the local cemetery. All around it are graves bearing the Buddhist inscription that is typical for that area. But on the Christian grave is carved a cross. And the big letters right below the cross say, I am the resurrection and the life. But below it, there is a list of the people who have been called to heaven. And next is the line from Hebrews, our citizenship is in heaven. That's a very telling statement in Japan. Our citizenship is in heaven. Philippians 3:20. Okay, in spite of these difficulties, the work progressed, and Cliff and Fran were able to leave the church in the hands of another local pastor and take a year of furlough back in the United States. After a year of traveling to visit and give reports to each of the churches that provided financial support for their missionary work, Cliff and Fran once again boarded a ship for Japan, this time with their infant son, yours truly, who was born during that time, and a Volkswagen microbus to replace the motorcycle and sidecar. And I am happy that I never had to ride in the motorcycle and sidecar as a small infant. So this is on the ship. You can see it's on a ship that's next to, or on the dock maybe. And there I am. And they took me on the ship, and I got there safely, and so did the motorcycle, my microbus. So here we are back in Japan with the microbus and the small me. And their son was joined in due course by, there I am again, by the fish paste church, the fish loaf church. You can see that it's a half cylinder. So here is Joy, and they were still at this barracks church. And in due time, it's reassuring to local people that the foreigners who come preaching these strange things also have children of their own. So they must be at least partly human. And here is their daughter Joy heading off to kindergarten. And here is their son Tim ready to head off to first grade. And here is the interior of the Wajima Church. And there is Francis giving a message using a flannel board there. The goal of any foreign missionary, of course, is to raise up local leadership. And here is Mr. Katsuda, one of the local believers, who is giving a message to these workers or fishermen who are taking a lunch break, perhaps. In the background, you see the microbus festooned with posters announcing an upcoming evangelistic meeting. Here is the Wajima Church. I think at about the time that our family was ready to head out for our first furlough, my parents' second furlough in 1969. It is common for missionaries making the rounds of their American supporting churches to make a presentation about their work in the foreign mission field and perhaps provide a taste of the exotic culture of that faraway place. The parents of these two missionary kids thought it would be cute to dress their children up in Japanese costumes. One of the children was not enthusiastic. Returning to Japan after a year of furlough in the United States, the Leonard family now settled in a different area, leaving Pastor Katsuda in charge of the Wajima Church. We were now located a bit closer to the population center of the area. But again, the work was the same. Cliff and Fran used a mix of methods, tent meetings, like the one we see here, door-to-door evangelism, and home meetings that ideally would gradually turn into house churches. And as before, they patiently fostered and trained local leadership from among the believers so that the Japanese church could carry on without the help of foreigners like themselves. Native pastors and evangelists will always have a better grasp of the language and their own culture. Cliff's persistence and patience slowly bore fruit as one believer here, another believer there, dedicated their lives to full-time Christian service, went to Bible school or seminary, and then returned to the Noto to become pastors and evangelists to their own people. And in time, there were 11 churches that traced their history in some way to the work of Clifford and Francis. Christians are still a tiny minority in Japan. And also here's one of those believers, Seto Akira-san, who later went on to be a pastor. Hanging behind him is a bed sheet with the words of the words of a song or a Bible verse written on them. Churches in Japan are much smaller than American churches because even at its peak, the Christian population of Japan was less than 1% of the whole population, and still is. It's a very, very minority religion. Some of these 11 churches have Sunday morning attendances of over 100, but others are much smaller, and 20 or 30, and even fewer. Most of these congregations are not able to provide complete financial support for their pastor, who then must have a side job to make ends meet. The pastor of the Wajima Church taught calligraphy, and other pastors have taught English or such things. The buildings are not impressive. They're sheet metal sometimes, they're small, they're not located in a beautifully landscaped area. But the members of these 11 congregations feel themselves to be in some way the spiritual children or grandchildren of Clifford and Francis. A good leader knows when it's time to step aside and let the next generation carry on the work. And so in December of 2000, Cliff and Fran retired from full-time missionary work in Japan and moved back to Cliff's home state of Oregon. And the 11 churches they established are carrying on to this day. And as their health permitted, Cliff and Fran would return to Japan for a few months, nearly every year, until recently, visiting their churches and encouraging the believers. Here it looks like Cliff has been officiating at a graveside service, because in the background we see the typical Japanese grave. They're in a Japanese cemetery here. And a year and a half ago, they celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary. By pure happenstance, Cliff died at about 3 o'clock last week on Friday afternoon, the same day of the week and the same time that Matthew chapter 27, verse 45 tells us that Jesus died. Cliff would have enjoyed this coincidence, but he would have reminded us immediately that the story told in the Gospel of Matthew does not end there. The story continues to the following chapter, where we read that on the first day of the week, that is Sunday, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to find the tomb empty, and an angel who told them, "He is not here, for he is risen as he said." And that story, the story of the risen Christ, that story is the important story of Clifford's life. Not the story of what Clifford Leonard did or accomplished, but the story that Clifford spent his life telling in Japan, and the story that countless others for the past 2,000 years have dedicated their lives to telling throughout the world in obedience to Jesus' command of Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Go ye therefore and teach all nations. Cliff heard the command and spent his life in obedience to it. So now we can end with words from a story that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 25, a story about a servant who did his best with what he had been given. Matthew 25, verse 21. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of thy Lord.